Welcome to Dig, a history podcast.
It's common knowledge that Australia was populated in large part by British convicts who had been sentenced to transportation in the 18th and 19th centuries. Perhaps less popular, but still known by many history lovers, is the story of the filles du roi, the young French women who were shipped off from France to populate the desolate villages of French Canada in the 17th century. Even slightly more obscure is the story of the Casket Girls, French women who arrived in New Orleans in the mid-1700s, gums bleeding from scurvy, hauling trunks behind them in the Gulf sands up to New Orleans' Ursuline convent to be reformed into suitable wives for French colonists. Spoiler, most historians agree that the Casket Girls did not even exist and that it's a misinterpretation of French law, which allowed for free passage and a complimentary trousseau for women who wished to accompany their husbands overseas. But the mostly apocryphal Casket Girls tale served as the grain of truth from which most New Orleans vampire lore derived. But there's another verified wave of forced migration that took place between early 18th century Paris and the French colonial Gulf Coast. And it's been virtually ignored until Joan DeJean's 2022 book, Mutinous Women. Though we'll use additional sources as well, we are particularly indebted to DeJean's monograph and the meticulous research that she undertook to uncover the story. I'm Marissa.
And I'm Averill.
And we are your historians for this episode of Dig.
We want to thank all of our Patreon supporters, and especially our fabulous auger and excavator level patrons: Lisa, Carl, Karen, Hannah, Jessica, Maria, Denise, Edward, Lauren, Colin, and Susan. We can't thank you enough. Listener, if you're not yet a patron of the show, it's easy. Just go to patreon.com/digpodcast to learn more.
Our own Elizabeth's new book, The Sentimental State, is in some ways a story of women who found agency in times of harrowing vulnerability and loss. As the podcast's early modernist, I wanted to back up a little bit and do this episode on women who did something similar but in entirely different circumstances. Also, we four just spent a weekend in New Orleans together, and I wanted to fit some NOLA history in here. You should know that while this episode plays off themes I love about Elizabeth's book, the content and research that this episode is based on is all the work of historian Joan DeJean. We're indebted to DeJean's meticulous research and passionate prose for most of the episode. Run, don't walk, to get her book, Mutinous Women: How French Convicts Became Founding Mothers of the Gulf Coast.
Early modern women were a little more vulnerable than earlier generations of women. Poor, single women were faced with the nearly impossible task of earning their own livings. Many ended up begging for alms or facing accusations of prostitution or witchcraft for daring to go it alone. Middling and elite women did little better. They were often married off at much younger ages than their poorer counterparts, traded like a commodity by their fathers and husbands. Stories of coerced or forced migration of French women, often under the guise of sponsored migration schemes in the early modern period, illustrate these precarities in lurid detail. These circumstances fall all over the spectrum, from penal transportations to an early modern version of mail-ordered brides. But the women who experienced them had much in common. We'll tell some of their stories today. But first, let's set the scene.
During the 1600s, the French Empire was an unmitigated disaster. They held claim to French Canada, French Louisiana, several Caribbean islands, and the Gulf Coast, which is often called the Mississippi. French settlements were woefully underfunded, disorganized, and underpopulated. The monarchy had deep financial troubles and no capital to invest in overseas ventures. Unlike the British, the French failed to offer incentives like land grants and subsidies to ordinary Frenchmen and women. Adventurous swashbucklers, ambitious military men, clergy, and risk-tolerant elites occasionally made the risky crossing, but more often than not, they were attracted to the Caribbean, where profits were proven. But there were very few ordinary families migrating who could offer labor or the needed trades. This lack of manpower and talent stagnated the colony's growth.
French migration restrictions also worked against them. After over 3 decades of religious warfare on French soil, the French monarchy struck a tenuous peace with the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which afforded French Protestants, called Huguenots, relative tolerance. But the edict was revoked in 1685, unleashing persecution against the Huguenots. One tenet of this persecution was migration restriction. Huguenots were barred from migrating to the New World. Think of how different this was from the English example. 6 of their early colonies were founded by religious separatists seeking refuge from religious persecution in England. Barring Huguenots, who had a reason to want to escape France, from relocating to the colonies, kept French colonial populations extremely low. Although the English method also eventually led to the American Revolution, so... To add insult to injury, the French colonies had public relations problems. The stories that filtered back to the metropole told of tropical pestilence in the Caribbean and Gulf Coast, extreme weather, blizzards and hurricanes, and violent conflicts with the Indians, such as the Beaver Wars between 1609 and 1701, the Fox Wars, 1712 to 1733, and the incredibly brutal Chickasaw Wars between the 1720s and the 1760s. One colonial governor wrote home, quote, "They are everywhere. They will stay hidden behind a stump for 10 days, existing on nothing but a handful of corn, waiting to kill a man or a woman. The Iroquois are not content to burn the houses. They also burn the prisoners they take, and give them death only after torturing them continually in the most cruel manner they can devise."
The French had assumed that since they were at a similar latitude as New France, that the weather would be similar. One French missionary, Father Bressani, wrote that the winter of 1653 in New France was so brutal that, quote, "a wolf in the woods licking a hatchet smeared with fat, which is cut with these tools, and then frozen, had left there the skin of its tongue," end quote. A Dutchman named Lepage Dupratz wrote about his travels to Louisiana country in 1718. He happened across an alligator, and according to him, quote, "I ran to my cabin to look for my gun, as I am a pretty good marksman. But what was my surprise when I came out and saw the girl, his native navigator, with a great stick in her hand, attacking the monster," end quote. Thus, life in the French colonies did not seem like an attractive prospect to most French people. It wasn't until the 18th century that the crown made an effort to encourage migration by winning hearts and minds in France. More on this later. This underpopulation problem created skewed sex ratios in colonial settlements that caused endless anxiety back at the metropole. French-Indian sexual relations were a double-edged sword for the empire and for the Catholic Church. Colonial authorities bemoaned the state of single male sexuality of the French colonists. Governor of Louisiana, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, wrote, quote, "The Canadians and the soldiers who are not married have female Indian slaves and insist that they cannot dispense with having them to do their washing and to do their cooking or to make their sagamity and to keep their cabins. Indeed, my lord, I cannot refrain from representing to you that the glory of God and the service of the king demand a remedy for such disorder, in which it will not be easy to attain the success except by lodging the troops in the fort from the governor to the lowest officers, permitting them to have only male slaves and not female. In regard to their washing, we shall be able to find French women who will take charge of it for the whole garrison, and instead of the Indian women, by deducting a fair salary from the pay of the officers and soldiers," end quote.
They reasoned that if colonial Frenchmen remained unmarried, they would seek out sex with prostitutes or concubines, or, more disturbingly, rape their Indian slave girls, and conceive children out of wedlock. So, for some, interracial marriage served as a protection against disorder and sin. French clergy even sought charitable donations to put toward dowries for Indian women to marry single French colonists. Jesuit missionary Paul Lejeune shared one example from 1639, quote, "A worthy and pious person has given 100 écus for the wedding of a young savage girl sought in marriage by a young Frenchman of very good character," end quote. Sometimes the French thought that Frenchmen's marriage to Indian women could be an advantage to the empire. Missionaries pontificated proudly about the Frenchmen bringing savagesses into the Christian fold, teaching them civilized French ways, language, custom, etc. But the French put zero resources into spreading French culture and social structures in the colonies. So it quickly became clear that the very few Frenchmen in the colonies were not enough of a force to establish French hegemony over the Indians. Given this reality, mixed marriages came to mean something quite different. Jean-Baptiste Dubois Duclos, Commissioner General of Louisiana, wrote, quote, "And although there are several examples of Indian women who have contracted such marriages, especially at the Illinois, it is not because they have become Frenchified, if one may use that term, but it is because those who have married them have themselves become almost Indians, residing among them and living in their manner, so that these Indian women have changed nothing, or at least very little, in their manner of living."
Yes. So it did not go to plan for the French. So the French invented the term ensauvagement, which is like ensavagement, to describe this phenomenon. Reports from the colony declared that nearly 800 Frenchmen had abandoned the colony for Indian villages by 1680. There were only about 8,000 males in all of New France at this point, so 800 deserters was 10% of the male population. Some French authorities worried about the biological impact of interracial relationships, claiming that miscegenation, which means the mixing of races, in French this is referred to as métissage, was itself a threat to the empire. Pierre de Rigaud de Vaudreuil, Governor General of New France, was especially hostile to métissage. In 1709, he wrote, quote, "One should never mingle a bad blood with a good one. Our experience in this country shows that the French who married savage women have become dissolute, idle, and have an unbearable independence. And their children are as lazy as the savages themselves. This must prevent us from permitting such marriages. Every child from these unions seems to try constantly to do a lot of harm to the French," end quote. Given the underpopulation problems and the anxieties among French authorities about what the skewed sex ratio meant for the empire, there were several schemes to import French wives for male colonists over the years. It's crucial to recognize that it's because of women's inherent vulnerability in early modern French society that these schemes were even possible. The most well-known scheme of this kind occurred from 1663 to 1673, and it involved the transportation of 800 French women called the filles du roi, or king's daughters, to French Canada. The filles du roi were so named because their transport and their dowries were paid for by the king, Louis XIV.
In a practical sense, the filles du roi were believed to be the solution to New France's underpopulation and desertion problems. But Louis XIV and his chief minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, spun this scheme as not only good imperial policy, but also as an act of charity. Indeed, the vast majority of filles du roi were recruited from convents, orphanages, and slums. They were incredibly vulnerable people. The Crown reasoned that without this program, these women may have descended into poverty, turning from pious women with unrealized potential to hopeless wretches, leading dissolute lives. While these were not women of means, there were some stringent standards for recruitment. The royal intendant, Jean Talon, was tasked with choosing women who were beautiful, healthy, and of peak childbearing age. During the later years of the scheme, Talon began demanding that clergy attest to the women's marriageability. Apparently, several married women had posed as maidens in order to get free transportation and a new start in the colonies, a clue that some women viewed the scheme as a way to escape unhappy marriages. Unfortunately for some of them, their earlier marriages were discovered. Talon also preferred women who came from the countryside. Most people believe country life was healthier for the body, but he was never able to recruit country women into the project.
But the insincerity of this quote-unquote charity is quite apparent to historians. During the 1660s, colonial governors begged the crown to ramp up its migration incentives for all people, not just potential wives. Colbert responded adversely, quote, "It would not be prudent for the king to depopulate his kingdom as would be necessary in order to populate Canada," end quote. The crown was happy to target undesirables that they did not mind losing for France, primarily women, but they worried about the brain drain that might occur if they encouraged larger-scale migration. Undoubtedly, they prioritized sexual pairings because they planned to grow New France's population through natural increase, which is like, the euphemism for baby making. Colbert wrote, quote, "New France will become populated gradually, and with the passing of a reasonable amount of time will become quite considerable," end quote. One might argue that the filles du roi were valued for their wombs above anything else, and that their absence from the metropole was perceived as preferable given their lack of prospects.
While the filles du roi populated French Canada as desired, the underpopulation problems in France's other territories was dire at the turn of the 18th century. The Louisiana colony was established in 1699. In the early years, there were approximately 300 colonists there, mostly men, living in makeshift military housing and always on the verge of death by starvation and exposure. The crown did not prioritize the delivery of goods to the Gulf Coast. They often only sent one ship of supplies per year, and even that ship was poorly stocked. The colonists hadn't figured out how to cultivate their staple crops in the salty bogs of coastal Louisiana, and their relative isolation from the metropole meant that they were forced to rely on Indian trading posts for their survival. The conditions were so bad that desertion was common. By 1706, more than 110 men had deserted to live with the Indians, with fewer than 200 colonists remaining in the crown's colony. Those who remained had to find refuge in Indian villages over the harsh winters.
This dire reality was, however, kept from the next batch of women who were brought to the colonies. Like the filles du roi, this small batch of girls, 20 in number, were regarded as pious and marriageable girls who would be good wives and mothers to the next generation of colonists. To them, Louisiana was described as a, quote, "flourishing colony flowing with milk and honey and teeming with well-established and successful men." They were promised that the colony was well-provisioned and that they would be leaving Paris for a life of ease in Louisiana, end quote. With these expectations, 20 young women boarded Le Pelican, which, obviously Pelican, headed for the Mobile settlement, Mobile, Alabama.
3 died from disease immediately upon arrival, and the rest faced the reality of imminent starvation. The Pelican Girls, as they become known, staged a rebellion known as the Petticoat Insurrection. They angrily protested their circumstances and boarded boats to escape. The captain refused to transport them, and the crown, upon hearing word of the ruckus, found their complaints unserious and amusing. They were abandoned to their fates. The Pelican Girls were supposed to consent to their migration and to their marriages, just like the filles du roi. But when Françoise Marie Anne Boisrenaud refused to marry after her arrival, Sieur de Bienville, New France's colonial administrator, tried to force her to marry against her will. As scholar Maria Azug points out, the treatment of the Pelican Girls foreshadowed the ensuing change in the Louisiana bridal program from one of nominal consent to one of outright kidnapping.
While there were whiffs of exploitation in the stories of the filles du roi and some direct evidence of it for the Pelican Girls, later transportation schemes dropped all pretense at charity, leaning into the exploitative practices they flirted with in the 1660s and the 1700s. Involuntary transportation was briefly banned after the miserable failure of the Pelican Girls scheme, and the next big scheme, less than a decade later, targeted women who were deemed even more undesirable. They were treated as criminals and prisoners, taken entirely against their will without due process, and some without ever having committed a crime. Nonetheless, they were branded as debauched harlots and dangerous criminals by unscrupulous authorities looking to make a buck. The backstory is quite complicated, but we will try to simplify it as much as possible. Remember, France's economy was in dire straits. They had massive deficits from decades of expensive wars and their practices of exempting nobility and clergy from taxes. Enter Scotsman and charlatan John Law. In 1717, Law convinced the French regent, Philip II, Duc d'Orléans, to grant him a charter to establish the Banque Générale, a private bank allowing the issuance of paper money backed by crown revenues. This was followed in 1719 by the creation of the Mississippi Company, which was granted a trade monopoly over Louisiana and French territories in North America. Remember, the Gulf Coast was known as the Mississippi at this point.
Law promoted fanciful stories about the riches and gold to be found in the Mississippi Valley in order to spark investment frenzies. Speculative trading in Mississippi Company shares reached a fever pitch, driving up prices to unsustainable levels in what became known as the Mississippi Bubble. Fueling this bubble was the prevalent myth that Louisiana was El Dorado, a land of untold mineral wealth. However, there had been no major gold or silver discoveries in the colony up to that point. Law's public relations campaign distorted the truth for his own financial gain. So what does this have to do with the transportation of French women to the colonies? As a Scotsman, John Law was familiar with Britain's penal transportation programs, which had been in effect for 100 years. He was also eager to populate the Mississippi to fuel his con. Everyone was so swept up in Mississippi mania that any protests they might have had against penal transportation were suppressed in hopes that Law's schemes would pay. In 1717, the ban on involuntary transportation was lifted. At the same time, the cruel warden of the Salpêtrière Women's Asylum was aware of Law's plans and saw an opportunity to rid herself of her most troublesome prisoners.
The Salpêtrière was a hospital and asylum, but it was used more as a house of corrections for troublesome women. We need to do an episode, I think, on the Salpêtrière one day because it has a millennium-long history, basically. The women deemed the most hopeless cases were imprisoned in La Force, which was, at the time, a decrepit, foul-smelling building swarming with vermin. Prisoners slept 6 to a bed, worked most of the day, and were fed very little. Some were beaten nearly to death. These brutal ministrations were overseen by a bailli, or warden. During the early 18th century, the bailli was Margaret Pancatelan. Pancatelan was admirably ambitious and cunning, but also unspeakably cruel. She weaponized the patriarchy against women less fortunate than herself for her own benefit.
It started with a disturbance at La Force. We only have Pancatelan's description of the event, which DeJean believes is highly fictionalized, and there's good reason to believe this, which we'll get to soon. Pancatelan wrote that on November 22nd, 1718, she was attacked by 3 creatures armed with knives who had slashed fellow prisoners and guards alike and were swearing and screaming the kinds of blasphemies against God that makes one's hair stand on end. The warden sent for armed guards to put down the disturbance, threw the alleged instigators in solitary confinement, and fed them just enough liquid to keep them alive.
When word of Law's promise to transport 6,000 criminals to the Mississippi reached her, Pancatelan was fuming about the abortive insurrection. She reasoned that this might be her opportunity to rid herself of her troublesome charges once and for all. Pancatelan composed a list of women prisoners who were, in her words, fit for the islands, and she set to work building a migration chain of unwilling prisoners. Most of them were convicts. Each of their convictions were investigated by DeJean, and nearly all of those convictions were dubious. Pancatelan and the Parisian police conspired together to take advantage of an opportunity to, quote, clean up the streets.
Some of these women were only guilty of being poor foreigners newly arrived in Paris to find refuge. DeJean found that the 5 Irish women on Pancatelan's list were arrested together and charged with prostitution. Knowing very little French, the Irish women were unable to mount a defense or even discern why they were arrested. It seems as if this prostitution charge was little more than speculation as to why foreign women might arrive in Paris in a group. The accusation of prostitution was used to incarcerate women who were simply unattached. DeJean found that these Irish women were Catholics who had escaped Protestant areas of Ireland in search of religious tolerance in a Catholic nation. Once they were brought to Pencatelyn, she embellished their stories, declaring them guilty of scandalous prostitution and claiming that one of them had been prostituted from the time she was 6. The assumptions and fabrications were used by Pencatelyn to add the Irish women, to the migration chain bound for Louisiana.
So it's possible they weren't doing anything illegal at all except just existing. For example, Marie Paris and Jean Lefebvre were couturiers or dressmakers. Couturiers were vulnerable to theft accusations because they typically came and went from elite households throughout the day. Paris and Lefebvre were accused of stealing diamond-covered buttons in 1716. During their trial, it became clear that there was no evidence that they were involved in the theft. They were acquitted, but banished from Paris. Having no other way to make a living other than in France's largest city, they returned against those orders. One day they were spotted by their previously arresting officer and arrested for violating the banishment order. During their arraignment, the officer declared, quote, "I certify that these women are prostitutes," end quote. Paris and Lefebvre were incarcerated and transported to Louisiana as a result of this arrest and the officer's oath. Marie Paris married Antoine Jobelin and lived the rest of her life in Royal Street in New Orleans. Jean Lefebvre, called Tantan by her friends, appears in the migration chain records but does not appear in any records in Louisiana, suggesting she died en route to the colonies.
Marie-Louise Brunet was also a victim of circumstance. From what we can tell, she was probably the illegitimate child of a woman who had been incarcerated for sorcery and being an abortionist. With nowhere else to go, the child was incarcerated with her mother in 1712. She was just 12 years old. 5 years later, Pencatelyn fabricated a backstory for her to justify her placement on the migration chain, labeling her as debauched but also very pretty. Once she arrived in Louisiana, Brunet reinvented herself, calling herself the daughter of Marie-Françoise Brunet and Philippe de Montfrain, and then later just Marie de Montfrain. Brunet married at least twice, which was common in a place where mortality was so high, and she had several children. She and her family lived on Royal Street in New Orleans, neighbors to Marie Paris, the woman Marissa just discussed. Brunet also founded a dynasty in colonial New Orleans, giving rise to families with the last names Charpentier, Duplantis, and Thibodeau through the marriages and offspring of her children.
Most of these women were domestic servants, among the most vulnerable of women. They weren't even tried or convicted, but rather found to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Marie Moule was confined to La Force on the say-so of a jealous wife. According to Jacqueline Coisset, she had, quote, the misfortune of hiring Marie as a domestic. But there had been a sexual relationship between Marie and this Ms. Coisset's husband, Charles Coisset. So Marie was dismissed. According to Mrs. Coisset, Marie continued to pursue her husband, and she wanted her incarcerated. Marie Moule was incarcerated in La Force based on Jacqueline Coisset's complaint. DeJean discovered that it was Charles Coisset, the man of the house, who had pursued Marie, perhaps even raped her. And he even abandoned his family and showed up at Salpêtrière demanding to see her. Marie's family petitioned for her release, but their request was not considered until the migration chain had already left Paris. She lived the rest of her life on the Gulf Coast and then in Illinois country, even mounting a rebellion and desertion plot in the colony after a decade of mistreatment by colonial authorities.
Catherine Boyard's story is similar. Boyard was added to the migration chain at the last minute, her legal case expedited to add her before the chain left Paris. Pencatelyn claimed on her list that Boyard's family had begged her to incarcerate the girl, but her police file says otherwise. One of the many ways DeJean discovered that Pencatelyn made mistakes and fabrications quite often. Boyard was incarcerated on the request of Catherine Lefebvre, wife of a Parisian merchant and dyer named Jean-Baptiste DeJean. Mrs. DeJean called Boyard merely the daughter of a woman who sells tripe, and declared that she was only after DeJean's money and had complete control over her husband. Mr. DeJean had apparently abandoned his family and left his wife and children destitute in Paris in his plans to be with his mistress. Mrs. DeJean begged the police to put Boyard behind bars, and they obliged.
Boyard's mother, indeed a tripe seller named Marie Leclerc, made a police report around the same time, saying that it was Mr. DeJean who was the one pursuing, right? We would now really call it stalking, her daughter. She provided proof that her daughter had left his employ and left Paris to get away from his advances. Again, it's possible she was being raped by him. But he left his family in Paris in pursuit of her and persuaded her to leave her new employment to come back with him. Leclerc had not seen or heard from her daughter since she left with DeJean, and she was concerned for her safety. Little did she know this was because her daughter had been incarcerated on the word of Mrs. DeJean.
The Paris police and warden Pencatelin were anxious to fill up this next migration chain, and they worked together to, as DeJean puts it, make the complexities disappear. Thus, Catherine Boyard joined the migration chain in the last moments, recorded as, quote, a loose woman who has corrupted DeJean, a married man, end quote. Her two sons, whom DeJean had claimed as his own, were lost to her forever and left behind in Paris. Boyard lived the rest of her life in Biloxi and then Mobile, marrying at least twice and becoming one of the founding mothers of colonial Mobile. While Boyard never saw her sons again, one of the other deported women who had been forced to leave her child behind was able to send for them years later and reunite in New Orleans.
Right, but that was very rare. Obviously, most people just never saw France or anyone from France again. Perhaps most sadly, some of these women just had the bad luck of being inconvenient for their families. The 22-year-old Anne-Françoise Roland, born to a poor family who shared a single room on the Rue Saint-Honoré, was denounced to the police by her own father, a fresh fish merchant. Without permission, she attended a dance at a local establishment and returned home with a young man who was apparently rude to her stepmother. Her father used this event as justification to demand his daughter be incarcerated in Salpêtrière. He offered no specifics or proof, merely accusing his own daughter of leading a, quote, shocking and scandalous life, that she was prone to, quote, debauchery and libertine behavior. He promised them 100 livres for her upkeep. This sealed the deal. DeJean found that Anne-Françoise's family was sunken in a financial quagmire and that her father's desire to be rid of her was one of convenience and thrift. She had a claim to a considerable inheritance from his late wife's family, and he was hell-bent on keeping it for himself. He never paid the 100 livres he had promised, but Anne-Françoise was convicted and transported nonetheless. Having arrived in the colonies, betrayed, and with no resources, Anne-Françoise managed to build a fortune and genetic legacy in Bourdelonville, Louisiana, where many of the residents are still her descendants.
Marie-Anne Boutin was also deported at the request of her parents. Boutin's father, who identified himself as a poor tailor, asked authorities that his incorrigible daughter be incarcerated and sent to the islands. While police investigated her lifestyle in search of something criminal, Marie-Anne was defiant. When an investigator gave her an order for an interrogation, Marie-Anne, quote, tore up the order and said she had nothing to tell him. Her noncompliance was all the authorities needed to incarcerate her. The court claimed, quote, you could not find a better place than Salpêtrière for this kind of libertine. When Pencatelin added Anne-Marie Boutin to her migration chain list, she added fabrications to beef up the claims against her, saying she was, quote, a known public prostitute who had committed adultery with a married man. Evidence of this claim was nowhere to be found in Boutin's legal proceedings. Anne-Marie Boutin survived the journey to Louisiana, but she died in a New Orleans hospital in 1727 during the city's leanest and most pestilence-ridden years.
As a direct result of Pencatelin's lies and the Parisian police's corruption, these women have gone down in history as prostitutes, madwomen, and hardened criminals. For the most part, even historians have taken them at their word, Joan DeJean accepted. By historians, they have been called, quote, teenage debauchees, libertines of dubious moral fiber, thieves, prostitutes, and assassins who, quote, reverted to their only means of gainful employment, which is prostitution. So these are historians saying this, just FYI. Historians also claim that few of them survived long enough in Louisiana to be of any import, their contributions to the colonies labeled as limited. One even claimed that their presence, quote, seriously retarded demographic growth. One called them, quote, parasites accustomed to drawing sustenance from a reasonably thriving social body, exhausted by long journeys and malnutritions, often in advanced stages of venereal disease, they died off rapidly, end quote. Side note, this is why it's important for historians to go back to the primary sources and reinterpret historical events over and over, because sometimes historians get it wrong. And their interpretations tell us more about them, like maybe if they're raging misogynists or just out-of-touch mediocre white men, right, than they do about the historical actors that they're writing about. We also want to make sure that our listeners know that there's nothing wrong with sex work. In the early modern period, women's means of generating income were limited. We have some evidence that casual prostitution was more common than historical peoples wanted to admit. So it's entirely possible that some of these women were sex workers or had dabbled in sex work at some point. For us, that doesn't have any impact on the injustice that was done to them.
These women's reputations as worthless criminals was part of the Crown's justification for severely underfunding the scheme. Unlike the filles du roi, on whom an estimated $1 billion in today's money was spent, this batch of transported women was executed on a shoestring budget. Many of them died as a result. When it became clear Louisiana did not contain the vast golden cities long rumored, the bubble burst in 1720. The Mississippi Company and Law's banking schemes collapsed, triggering an economic crisis and near bankruptcy for France. Investor fortunes were wiped out. So while Law's plans helped briefly promote interest and settlement in Louisiana through tale of its riches, they were fundamentally based on speculation and deception rather than any tangible gold rushes or mineral discoveries in France's American colony. The aftermath left the French economy in ruins for years.
So there was no money to organize, populate, or provision the colonies for at least a decade upon the women's arrival. Even when the women were detained on the coast of France, waiting for their ship to be made ready, no one made provisions for their food or shelter. Seeing their poor conditions and that they were near starvation, one man took pity on them and donated meals for them to eat as they waited. Their ships were poorly provisioned, so there wasn't enough food even for the crew, much less their prisoners. They weren't given bedding or clothes, and they were not allowed out of the ship's hold on account of their status as prisoners. We don't know how many of them died during the voyage.
Their first taste of freedom was almost more scary than their incarceration, because they were left on Ship Island, a small, uninhabited island without any man-made shelters or food stores. They had not been given clothes or blankets and were wearing mere rags. DeJean comments that these events resembled an exile onto a deserted island. The women were essentially being left for dead, having to fend for themselves. We don't know how they managed to survive, but we do know that after their stay on Ship Island, navigators came to the island to map it, and even they, on a planned expedition, were reduced to eating wild cats and oysters. It's unclear how long they were marooned on Ship Island, but eventually the women were relocated to the failing colony of Biloxi, soon to be called Old Biloxi because the settlement had to be moved. From there, most of the women deserted and found their way to New Orleans, which was a newer settlement, still under-provisioned and remote, but with better potential. Some went to New Biloxi, some to Mobile, one or two to Indian villages, and some to extremely remote encampments along the Mississippi. The women who relocated to New Orleans tended to do the best, many of them remaining close and their families intermarrying and standing in as godparents for each other. Some, like Marie Catherine LaRoche, built vast real estate empires.
While many have called them corrections girls, these were the 100-some-odd women who sailed on the aptly named La Mutine, which translates as the mutinous woman, in 1719. Joan DeJean was the first historian to bother tracing each of these women's lives in France, to investigate their legal troubles, and to trace which of them arrived in Louisiana alive and what became of them. She found that not only were almost none of them prostitutes and criminals, but that most of them survived despite the crown's unconscionable neglect, and went on to build lives, families, and fortunes in colonial New Orleans, Biloxi, and Mobile. With their success unacknowledged, the maligned reputations of the corrections girls, a direct result of Parisian police corruption and Penn-Catalan's cruel indifference, went down in history books. The same Paris authorities who botched the correction girls' cases were investigated and prosecuted for misconduct and corruption in the years following the transportation. But still, historians repeated Penn-Catalan's and the police's lies without question for decades. This is why women's history matters. Without a persistent focus on historical women, without the refusal to repeat the lies of historical people who had clear motivations for lying, without an internal motivation to painstakingly connect the dots of historical records created by people who thought them worthless, we're missing half of history. I just find it really interesting that historians, right, who were trained historians, just sort of took Penn-Catalan and Bienville and all these people who were kind of involved in these transportations, just like took them at their word. And they were like, oh yeah, obviously these were all like worthless prostitutes, right? Obviously, even prostitutes aren't worthless, obviously, but right. But even just labeling them, not only were they not worthless, but they also weren't even prostitutes, right? And they also weren't even criminals. And it's really interesting because once the women get to the island, so in British transportation schemes, they tended to be indentured when they arrived, right? So they weren't just like doing whatever the heck they wanted. But France was so disorganized that nobody created any sort of system for what would happen when they got there. And so they just abandoned them there and were like, okay, whatevs, I guess make babies, you know? And so it was so disorganized that didn't happen. So in a way, they got their freedom when they were dropped off there, but really they were like abandoned, right, and neglected. And so it's just amazing. These women like went on to make good marriages and like even become elites, part of like the ton in New Orleans. Yeah. And we're supposed to believe that they were like worthless, you know, like worthless, untalented, crappy people or whatever, right? So it's like, obviously there's something missing. And so DeJean was really good at figuring out what was missing. And that is, there was stuff missing from every step of the transportation scheme. And some of the women, one didn't have a trial at all and was just like chained up with the women, like when they had already left Paris, right? So this is a very sort of clapdash thing. And I think it really illustrates well how vulnerable women were, right? Because this would not be happening with men. I think the corruption and all that stuff could happen with men. So the actual historical event could have happened. But when historians talked about them, they're not going to be like, oh, they were worthless criminals and they probably all died anyway, so who cares? Like nobody really bothered to kind of chase up their details when they arrived. Nobody cared until the 2020s. Someone was like, I'm going to tell this story, right? And so this to me is a really good example of how we still really, really need women's history.
Or even, not even just tell the story, but retell the story and fact checked, right?
Right. Like be an actual good historian and do what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Sarah was just talking about this in our group chat the other day, or maybe I saw she posted on Twitter that this happens multiple times, right? Like people requote and requote the same like uncontextualized excerpts from these primary sources, but then never go back to actually like look at the full original primary source or look at the original primary source with a more critical eye, right? Like obviously DeJean has done with this book. I think it's a problem.
Yeah.
It's endemic.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and it makes historians look like idiots, right? Because then when we come back and say, actually, we got it wrong, this is what happened, people are like, you can't revise history or whatever. And it's like, Well, yeah, you can. When the history is done super crappily and isn't doing justice to the historical people or even to our understanding of these historical people, it's not doing justice to those things, then it has to be redone. So I think this is one of those examples. One other thing I wanted to mention about the DeJean book is that there was actually parts of the book that kind of bothered me. She seems to think that like calling these women prostitutes or sex workers was like a slur, and so her entire point of the book is to like prove they were not sex workers or prostitutes, and like whenever someone called them that, she would explain why they weren't those things. And so for me, the book would have been a little bit better if she was like, okay, well, even if they were, like, who the hell, like, why does that mean anything? You know what I mean?
Right, yeah.
So you can tell she's a little old school in that sense. I think that she finds the implication that they were sex workers to be offensive and to devalue them somewhat. And so that's something that kind of annoyed me, that she kind of spent too much time trying to prove they weren't sex workers when, like, I don't think that even matters, whether they were sex workers or not.
I mean, I guess it mattered for the way that society would have perceived them.
Yeah.
At the time.
And it mattered as
right?
to whether they were actually doing infractions of the law, I guess, right?
Right. Yeah.
So I guess that matters. But I also don't think that there is a way to know that for sure.
Sure.
And I also think that there were plenty of really respectable women in early 18th century France who did occasional sex work for extra money because they're all just living this economy of makeshift, right? And so, and they did it on the down low. I think that there, were might have been a class of prostitutes or something, but then there were also just people who just did sex work, And so for me, I think, I don't know. And also it's just hard to tell because pretty much every woman who was just walking around, one of the women who was arrested and deported, she was a working woman. She worked all day and then she stopped at like a pub and got a beer, like an ale or small ale, and was sitting there with her friend when the pub was raided and she was arrested and convicted of prostitution. But she was just a woman who was drinking beer with her friend after work. So it's just because the authorities said that someone was a prostitute, they just said that. They just said that every time a woman was by herself, So in that sense, I can see why DeJean is like, no, like they weren't actually prostitutes. But I would hazard a guess that some of them probably were. But I still don't think that means they deserved what they got, And then DeJean kind of goes on and on about like, all of the horrible ways they were treated and how they were neglected by the metropole and all that stuff. All true. But then she's a little too triumphant, I guess, when she describes what became of them. Because I guess her point is that they suffered all of this, but they persisted nonetheless, kind of thing. And I think that is maybe her point. But to me, claiming that, France didn't give them anything and made it really hard for them, but then just like showing that they built vast fortunes and became really fancy people in New Orleans, for some of them, sort of undermines that.
I mean, it undermines it, but it also ignores the like racial and class social structures that supported their alleged, their rise.
Their rise, right?
Yeah.
Like some of them were slave owners and stuff.
Right.
I think that's totally right. But I also think that she's taking advantage of the fact that we don't have documentation about certain things. So like she'll say things like, oh, we don't have documentation that they were given tents. So they probably just like slept out in the, in the winter and almost died. And it's like, well, or they could have just gotten tents or stayed with people. We just don't know that because we don't have the documentation, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I think you have to be careful about your interpretations and always be trying to think to yourself, like, is this a fair and accurate interpretation given what I know, Right. I think she's a little too close to the topic in some ways.
An absence of evidence is not an evidence of absence.
Right, exactly. I think every now and then she kind of goes down that rabbit hole, but it's a really, really good book. And so many of the families ended up living on Royal Street, which like we had just, when I read this book, we had just been walking up and down Royal Street, for days. And I was just like, oh my gosh, and so it's so wild. And there's like one who owned a house right across from the present day Café du Monde, the one that we went to, one of those houses that was across the street from there, it's now like a little shop or whatever, was owned by another one of the deported women. And DeJean was able to connect it because when they got married, it specifically said that the woman had come to the colony de force or by force. So not super, super connected to Elizabeth's book, but it's about women, and Elizabeth's book is about women.
I mean, Elizabeth's book is about women resisting and overcoming in some ways the limitations on their sex and gender roles in the time period in which they live in order to, her book is more about women trying to make reform for other people, right? Like improve the conditions for a larger set of people. And obviously these women were trying to make a better life for themselves. But I think the restrictions and the systems that held them back in some ways and that they had to resist are this is patriarchy. Yeah.
Really similar. Yeah, and they also, I think, Elizabeth's women that she writes about learned ways to, like, use the patriarchy against itself, and say, okay, well, I'm nothing but a wife and mother. Okay, well, I'm using my wifeliness and my motherliness to make this reform, right? And these women did that as well, right? So they found ways to carve out some agency and to kind of use the patriarchy against itself for their own benefit. And so I think that's the connection that I saw.
So we want to thank you all for joining us today. We invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram at dig_history, or join our Facebook group, Dig History Pod Squad, for all kinds of memes and historian hijinks. If you have a comment or a question or want to share some kind words with us, you can always email us at hello@digpodcast.org, because we love listener mail. If you're an educator, we've got a compendium of episodes that you can use in the classroom and some free teaching resources, including full lesson plans, on our website, digpodcast.org. And that's where you'll also find full bibliographies, the scripts for all of our episodes, resources, and a link to our swag store, as well as links to all of our books that we have out right now, including you can pre-order our co-authored book, Spiritualism's Place, Reformers, Seekers, and Seances in Lilydale, and of course, Elizabeth's book, The Sentimental State. Get your copy today.
Bye.
Bye.
To grant him a chapter, oh my God.
The woman Marissa just discussed. Fidura, damn it. I say it, Fidura. Well, the Fidura, no, we can't do it. The R's there and it's f***ing me up. Time she was sick.
6, sorry.
That makes more sense. Marie and Mutine.
Bhutan.
I have a friend in high school who's Bhutan. That's what we said. That's how we said it in Vermont.
Well, that's the anglicized version. That makes sense.
There's a whole bunch of Bhutans in that town.
So many Bhutans.
They make good maple syrup.